I sit in my car in the company parking lot, hands trembling as I stare at the termination letter clutched between my fingers. 3 years of flawless performance reviews, destroyed over a $15 milk tea. HR's cold words still echo in my mind like a broken record. Theft of company resources is grounds for immediate termination. But what they don't know is that I've been recording every conversation, documenting every policy violation, and I just discovered their illegal tax evasion scheme. As I open my phone to make one final entry, I catch sight of the CEO and company lawyer rushing toward my car, their faces twisted with sheer panic. 3 weeks earlier, I was working late again at Pinnacle Digital Solutions, hunched over my computer as the office lights automatically dimmed around me. The Morrison Industries account presentation sprawled across my dual monitors, charts and graphics bleeding into each other as my eyes burned from exhaustion. As the lead coordinator for the biggest client pitch in company history, I felt the weight of $50 million in potential revenue pressing down on my shoulders. My name is Dolores, and at 28, I was the newest team member assigned to this make-or-break project. Most people would have crumbled under the pressure, but I thrived on challenges that others avoided. The empty office felt like my personal battlefield, where I could focus without the constant interruptions that plagued normal business hours. Brad Hutchinson, our CEO, had built Pinnacle Digital Solutions from a cramped garage startup into a powerhouse generating $50 million in annual revenue. His corner office overlooked the entire floor, glass walls providing him a clear view of every employee's workstation. Brad possessed that magnetic charisma that made investors open their wallets and clients sign contracts, but something about his smile always felt rehearsed, like he was constantly performing for an invisible audience. Jessica Walsh ran our human resources department with military precision, her auburn hair always pulled into a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense attitude. She claimed to prioritize employee welfare, but her decisions consistently favored management over staff concerns. What most people didn't realize was that Jessica was Brad's cousin, a family connection carefully hidden from the employee handbook. My closest ally in the office was Tommy Rodriguez, a graphic designer whose infectious laugh could brighten even the most stressful deadlines. Tommy had worked at Pinnacle for 5 years, long enough to understand the undercurrents of office politics that newcomers like me navigated blindly. His desk sat 3 cubicles away from mine, close enough for whispered conversations when supervisors weren't watching. Then there was Sarah Brennan, my supposed mentor and the senior marketing manager who should have been guiding my professional development. Sarah had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of strategic networking and calculated risks, earning respect from upper management while maintaining a friendly facade with subordinates. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer suits projected success, but I was beginning to suspect that her achievements came at other people's expense. The Morrison Industries presentation consumed my every waking moment, demanding 16-hour workdays that left me surviving on coffee and determination. Morrison represented more than just another client. They were a Fortune 500 company whose endorsement could transform Pinnacle from a regional player into a national contender. The pressure was immense, but I felt ready to prove myself worthy of the opportunity. Late one evening, as I worked alone in the office kitchen preparing my usual milk tea blend, I heard the distinct click of heels approaching. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from surprise to something that resembled disapproval. She watched me steep the tea bag in company-provided hot water, adding a splash of milk from the refrigerator that was regularly restocked for employee use. "Taking liberties with company property, I see," Sarah commented, her tone light but carrying an edge that made me look up from my mug. I laughed, assuming she was joking. Just trying to stay caffeinated for another all-nighter. This Morrison presentation is keeping me busier than a one-legged cat in a sandbox. Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes as she poured herself a glass of water from the cooler. "Of course. We all make sacrifices for important clients." The conversation felt oddly tense, but I attributed it to the stress we were all feeling about the upcoming presentation. Sarah left the kitchen without another word, her heels echoing down the hallway as I returned to my workstation. Something about her reaction bothered me, but I pushed the feeling aside and focused on perfecting the marketing strategy that would hopefully secure Morrison's business. The next morning brought an unwelcome discovery that changed everything. I arrived early, as usual, eager to review my presentation files before the team meeting. But when I opened my computer, several key documents were missing entirely. Slides I had spent hours crafting had vanished from the shared drive, replaced by corrupted files that displayed nothing but error messages. My heart raced as I checked the file history, trying to understand what had happened overnight. The timestamps showed that someone had accessed my files at 2:30 in the morning, well after I had left the office. Certain sections of the presentation had been deleted entirely, while others contained subtle but significant changes that would make our proposal look amateurish to Morrison's executives. I immediately called Tommy, knowing he often worked late and might have seen something unusual. His voice was groggy when he answered, clearly having been awakened by my early morning panic. "Dolores? What's wrong? You sound like someone stole your favorite coffee mug." "Someone sabotaged my Morrison files," I explained, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "Whole sections are gone, and the budget projections have been changed to numbers that make no sense." Tommy was fully alert now, his protective instincts kicking in. "That's not an accident, and you know it. Someone wanted to make you look incompetent before the biggest presentation of your career." As I frantically tried to restore my files from backup copies, I noticed Sarah arriving at the office with an unusual spring in her step. She greeted everyone with excessive enthusiasm, as if she was celebrating some private victory that the rest of us weren't aware of. When she passed my desk, she made a point of asking how my presentation was progressing, her concern sounding completely fabricated. "Running into any technical difficulties?" she inquired, tilting her head with mock sympathy. Sometimes these computer systems can be so unreliable. The way she emphasized technical difficulties sent chills down my spine. I realized that Sarah knew exactly what had happened to my files because she was the one responsible for their destruction. But I couldn't prove it yet, and accusations without evidence would only make me look paranoid and unprofessional. My suspicions were confirmed later that morning when Morrison Industries called our office, confused about conflicting information they had received regarding our proposal. The client representative explained that someone from Pinnacle had sent them an alternative version of our marketing strategy, one that contradicted the materials I had been preparing for weeks. I requested copies of what Morrison had received, and my worst fears were realized. Sarah had been sending them altered versions of our proposal, deliberately designed to make me appear incompetent and unprepared. The budget figures were wrong, the timeline was unrealistic, and the marketing approach contradicted everything we had discussed in previous meetings with the client. This wasn't just office politics or professional jealousy. This was deliberate sabotage, orchestrated by someone I had trusted to guide my career development. Sarah was systematically destroying my reputation with our most important client, and she was doing it with surgical precision. Sarah's campaign against me intensified over the following days, spreading through the office like a carefully planted virus. She began having private conversations with other team members, conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. The atmosphere around my desk grew noticeably cooler, as if I had been marked with some invisible scarlet letter. During team meetings, Sarah would interrupt my presentations with pointed questions that seemed designed to highlight gaps in my knowledge rather than clarify important details. She questioned my budget estimates, criticized my timeline projections, and suggested that my approach to Morrison Industries might be too aggressive for such a conservative client. Her comments were always phrased professionally, making it impossible to call out her behavior without seeming defensive. Other colleagues began treating me differently, offering polite smiles instead of genuine warmth. Jennifer from accounting stopped inviting me to lunch, while Mark from sales avoided making eye contact during hallway encounters. I felt like I was being slowly erased from the social fabric of the workplace, isolated through whispers and subtle exclusions that left no fingerprints. But I wasn't going to accept defeat without fighting back. I started documenting everything with the methodical precision of a detective building a case. Every email was screenshot and saved to multiple locations, every conversation was followed up with written summaries, and every file edit was tracked with timestamps and version histories. If Sarah wanted to play dirty, I would make sure there was a paper trail documenting her every move. My digital investigation revealed patterns that confirmed my suspicions. Sarah had been accessing my computer files during off hours, using what appeared to be administrative privileges that she shouldn't have possessed. The timestamps showed a clear progression of sabotage, starting with small changes to my documents and escalating to complete deletion of critical presentation materials. More disturbing was what I discovered in the company's financial records, which Sarah had carelessly left accessible on a shared network drive. Budget allocations didn't match the amounts being charged to clients, vendor payments showed suspicious patterns, and expense reports contained line items that made no logical sense. Either Sarah was incredibly sloppy with financial data, or something more serious was happening at Pinnacle Digital Solutions. Tommy became my unofficial ally in this corporate chess game, providing moral support and crucial intelligence about office dynamics. During our lunch break, he pulled me aside with information that made my blood run cold. "Sarah and Brad go way back," he explained, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "They were college roommates at Northwestern, and she's been promised the marketing director position once Brad creates it. You're not just competition for her, Dolores. You're an obstacle to her predetermined career path." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. No wonder Sarah felt comfortable sabotaging my work and undermining my reputation. She had inside information and protected status that made her virtually untouchable within the company hierarchy. But Tommy had more disturbing news to share. "You're not the first talented person to suddenly become unpopular around here," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Two other employees were driven out in the past 18 months through similar tactics. Both were performing well until suddenly they couldn't do anything right, and eventually they quit rather than fight the uphill battle." Armed with this knowledge, I devised a plan to expose Sarah's sabotage attempts. I created a fake presentation filled with deliberately terrible ideas and marketing strategies that no competent professional would ever recommend to a client. The document contained budget projections that were wildly unrealistic, timeline estimates that defied logic, and marketing approaches that would have been laughable if they weren't so obviously wrong. I saved this decoy presentation in a location where I knew Sarah would find it, making it appear like my genuine work product for an upcoming client pitch. Then I waited, monitoring the file access logs to see when she would take the bait. Sure enough, Sarah accessed the fake presentation at 11:45 that night, spending nearly 30 minutes reviewing what she believed was my actual work. The next morning, she walked into the conference room with unusual confidence, ready to present what she thought were my ideas to a potential client from Denver. Watching Sarah pitch those ridiculous concepts to a room full of executives was both satisfying and painful. She recommended a marketing campaign based entirely on interpretive dance, suggested a budget that exceeded the client's annual revenue, and proposed a timeline that would require the project to be completed before it officially started. The client representatives exchanged bewildered glances while Brad's face turned increasingly red with embarrassment. After the disastrous presentation, Sarah tried to deflect blame by claiming the materials had been corrupted or tampered with, but the damage was already done. She had voluntarily presented ideas so absurd that no amount of explanation could restore her credibility with that particular client. For the first time since this corporate warfare began, I felt like I had scored a meaningful victory. But Sarah's humiliation only intensified her determination to destroy my career. She became more reckless in her sabotage attempts, less careful about covering her tracks, and more obvious in her efforts to turn other employees against me. The fake presentation incident had wounded her pride, and wounded predators are always the most dangerous. The psychological toll of constant workplace harassment was beginning to affect my sleep, my appetite, and my ability to concentrate on important tasks. Every morning brought new uncertainty about what Sarah might have done overnight to undermine my work, and every interaction with colleagues felt like walking through a minefield of potential betrayals. Despite the stress, I continued documenting every incident of sabotage and building an increasingly comprehensive case against Sarah's misconduct. I knew that eventually, her recklessness would provide me with the evidence needed to expose her behavior to upper management. But I also suspected that the problem at Pinnacle Digital Solutions ran much deeper than one vindictive employee with personal ambitions. Sarah's desperation became increasingly apparent as her previous tactics failed to achieve their intended goal. The embarrassment from the failed client presentation had left her reputation damaged within the company, and I could see her searching for a way to regain her standing while simultaneously eliminating me as competition. Her behavior became more erratic, her accusations more far-fetched, and her willingness to cross ethical boundaries more pronounced. She began spreading increasingly elaborate rumors about my professional conduct, claiming that I had been arriving late to work despite my well-documented habit of being first in the office most mornings. She suggested to anyone who would listen that I was stealing office supplies, being unprofessional with clients during phone calls, and taking credit for other people's ideas without permission. What I didn't know at the time was that Sarah had enlisted Jessica from Human Resources as an active accomplice in her campaign against me. The family connection between Jessica and Brad created a web of loyalty that extended beyond professional obligations, making HR complicit in behavior that violated every principle of fair employment practices. Jessica began scheduling unnecessary meetings to discuss my performance concerns, meetings that were clearly designed to create a paper trail of disciplinary actions rather than address any legitimate workplace issues. She would ask leading questions about my time management, my relationships with colleagues, and my understanding of company policies, always framing her inquiries in ways that suggested underlying problems. The trap they set for me was both ingenious and petty, targeting the one weakness they could exploit, my tendency to work late hours when preparing important presentations. Jessica issued a memo to building security, instructing them to monitor the kitchen area more closely for inventory management purposes. She claimed that office supplies were disappearing and that closer surveillance might identify the source of the problem. Meanwhile, Sarah deliberately scheduled me for impossible deadlines that required overnight work sessions. The Morrison Industries presentation was just the beginning. Suddenly, every project came with unrealistic expectations and compressed timelines that forced me to spend entire nights in the office to meet delivery requirements. During one of these marathon work sessions, I received an emergency phone call that changed everything. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor who lived alone, had fallen in her bathroom and couldn't get up. She had managed to call me instead of 911, probably because she was embarrassed about the situation and hoped to avoid involving paramedics if possible. I immediately abandoned my work and rushed to help her, leaving my milk tea preparation half-finished on the kitchen counter. Mrs. Henderson had indeed fallen, but fortunately she wasn't seriously injured beyond some bruising and a twisted ankle. I helped her get comfortable, made sure she had everything she needed, and stayed with her until her daughter could drive over from the next town. By the time I returned to the office the following morning, the trap had already been sprung. Jessica called me into her office with the solemnity of a funeral director, her expression conveying disappointment that seemed completely disproportionate to whatever infraction she planned to discuss. "Dolores, we need to talk about your use of company resources," she began, consulting a file that appeared to contain security footage, screenshots, and witness statements. "Building Security has documented multiple instances of you using company property for personal consumption." I felt my stomach drop as I realized what this was about. "You mean the tea and milk from the kitchen? Those are provided for employee use during long work sessions." Jessica shook her head gravely, as if I had just confessed to embezzling thousands of dollars from the company treasury. Theft of company resources is a serious matter, regardless of the monetary value involved. "We've received written complaints about your behavior from other employees who are concerned about this pattern of misconduct." The written complaints turned out to be a single statement from Sarah, claiming that she had observed me stealing food and beverages for weeks and that my behavior was creating a negative work environment for other team members. The statement was filled with exaggerations and outright lies, but it provided the documentation that Jessica needed to justify her predetermined course of action. As Jessica continued her lecture about company policy and professional standards, I caught a glimpse of Sarah's computer screen through the open office door. What I saw made my blood freeze. Spreadsheets containing inflated expense reports, vendor payments to companies I didn't recognize, and financial figures that didn't match any legitimate business expenses I could identify. The numbers were staggering. Invoices for consulting services from companies with generic names like Sunset Holdings LLC and Pacific Business Solutions, each billing Pinnacle Digital Solutions for amounts that seemed wildly excessive for the services described. The pattern suggested a systematic scheme to move money through fake vendors, possibly for tax evasion or outright embezzlement. I tried to process this information while Jessica continued her rehearsed speech about the importance of following company policies and maintaining professional standards. The irony was overwhelming. They were preparing to fire me for using tea bags and milk that were explicitly provided for employee consumption, while the company was apparently involved in financial fraud that dwarfed my supposed transgression by several orders of magnitude. I understand your concerns, I replied carefully, not wanting to reveal what I had discovered on Sarah's computer. I'm happy to reimburse the company for any kitchen supplies I've used during my overtime work sessions. Would $5 cover the total cost? Jessica's response revealed that this had nothing to do with tea bags or company resources. This isn't about the money, Dolores. It's about respect for company property and following established procedures. We need employees who understand boundaries and demonstrate appropriate judgment. The disciplinary meeting was clearly a formality designed to create legal cover for a termination decision that had already been made. Jessica had no interest in hearing my explanations or accepting reimbursement for the minimal cost involved. This was about eliminating me from the company while avoiding the legal complications that would arise from firing an employee without documented cause. But as Jessica prepared her final remarks about company policy and professional expectations, I was already planning my next move. The financial irregularities I had glimpsed on Sarah's computer represented a much bigger story than workplace harassment or wrongful termination. If Pinnacle Digital Solutions was involved in systematic fraud, then multiple people were going to face consequences far more serious than job loss. The disciplinary meeting took a predictable turn as Jessica and Brad converged on me with the coordinated precision of practiced executioners. Brad entered the conference room with theatrical gravity, his usual charismatic smile replaced by an expression of disappointed authority that he had probably perfected during countless similar confrontations. Dolores, I'm genuinely sorry it's come to this, he began, settling into the chair across from me like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. When Jessica brought these concerns to my attention, I hoped we could resolve them through counseling and additional training. But theft of company property, regardless of the amount involved, creates liability issues that we simply cannot ignore. His words carried the weight of finality, but something about his delivery felt rehearsed and artificial. This wasn't a disappointed boss dealing with employee misconduct. This was a performance designed to provide legal cover for a predetermined outcome. I could see Jessica taking notes, presumably documenting my reactions for the termination file that would protect the company from wrongful termination lawsuits. I understand your position, I responded, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. But I think there's been a misunderstanding about the kitchen supplies. Those tea bags and milk are provided specifically for employees working extended hours, and I've never taken anything that wasn't freely available for office use. Brad waved away my explanation with dismissive authority. The specifics aren't really the point here, Dolores. What matters is that we need employees who understand and respect boundaries, especially during these challenging economic times. His mention of challenging economic times struck me as particularly ironic, given what I had observed on Sarah's computer screen. If Pinnacle Digital Solutions was struggling financially, it certainly wasn't because employees were using tea bags during overtime work sessions. The real financial drain was apparently coming from fraudulent vendor payments and inflated expense reports that dwarfed my supposed transgression by thousands of dollars. I want to be completely transparent with you, Brad continued, his tone shifting to something that resembled confession. We're restructuring the marketing department to improve efficiency and reduce overhead costs. Several positions will be eliminated over the next few months, and this incident has forced us to accelerate that timeline in your particular case. The truth finally emerged through his carefully crafted explanation. This had nothing to do with tea bags or company policy violations. Brad needed to eliminate positions to cut costs, and the milk tea incident provided convenient justification for avoiding severance payments and unemployment insurance claims. I was being sacrificed to improve quarterly profit margins, with Sarah's accusations serving as legal camouflage for what amounted to economic termination. So, you're firing me to save money on severance packages, I summarized, wanting to make sure I understood the real motivation behind this elaborate charade. Brad's expression hardened as he realized his strategic mistake. I'm terminating your employment for cause, which means you're not entitled to severance compensation or positive references for future employment opportunities. This decision is final and effective immediately. As I began clearing my personal belongings from my desk, something unexpected happened that changed everything. My computer chimed with an incoming email notification, and the message that appeared on my screen was clearly meant for Sarah rather than me. The sender was listed as Sunset Holdings LLC, and the subject line read, Quarterly Payment Schedule, Confidential. I quickly opened the email before anyone could stop me, and what I found was smoking gun evidence of systematic financial fraud. The message contained detailed instructions for routing payments through offshore accounts, inflating invoice amounts to create untraceable cash flows, and coordinating with other fake vendor companies to avoid detection by auditors or tax authorities. The scope of the scheme was breathtaking. Brad hadn't just created one fraudulent vendor relationship. He had established an entire network of shell companies designed to siphon money from Pinnacle Digital Solutions while making the transactions appear legitimate to casual observers. The total amount involved exceeded $2 million, spread across multiple fiscal years and disguised as routine business expenses. I used my phone to photograph the email and several related documents that were visible on nearby computer screens. The evidence included vendor contracts with obviously fake companies, expense reports containing impossible charges, and correspondence discussing strategies for avoiding detection by accounting firms and government regulators. Tommy appeared at my desk during this frantic documentation process, pretending to help me pack my personal items while actually serving as a lookout for approaching supervisors. As I stuffed photographs and documents into my purse, he whispered urgent information that added another layer to the conspiracy. "I've been collecting evidence for months," he explained, slipping me a small flash drive while pretending to hand me a pen from my desk drawer. "Brad's been sexually harassing female employees and paying them off to keep quiet. The financial fraud is just part of a bigger pattern of corruption that goes all the way to the board of directors." The flash drive contained documentation of payroll irregularities, falsified safety inspection reports, and recorded conversations between Brad and various employees discussing illegal activities. Tommy had apparently been conducting his own investigation, motivated by witnessing misconduct that he couldn't ignore or report through normal channels. As security personnel arrived to escort me from the building, I managed to upload all of this evidence to a secure cloud storage account using my phone's data connection. The photographs, documents, and Tommy's flash drive contents were automatically synchronized to multiple backup locations, ensuring that Brad couldn't destroy the evidence, even if he somehow gained access to my personal devices. But the most crucial step was sending an encrypted email to the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower program, complete with financial records proving tax evasion totaling over $2 million. The IRS offered substantial rewards for information leading to successful prosecution of tax fraud, and my documentation provided everything they would need to launch a comprehensive investigation. Sitting in my car in the company parking lot, I made one final entry on my phone, a detailed summary of everything I had discovered, complete with timestamps, witness names, and cross-references to the supporting documentation. This wasn't just about getting revenge on the people who had wrongfully terminated my employment. This was about exposing systematic corruption that harmed employees, clients, and taxpayers who deserved better from companies operating in their communities. As I finished typing, I noticed Brad and David Klein, the company lawyer, rushing toward my car with expressions of panic that suggested they had realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had fired the one person who could expose their entire criminal enterprise, and now she was sitting in the parking lot with evidence that could destroy everything they had built. David Klein reached my car first, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic as he tapped frantically on my driver's side window. Through the glass, I could see him trying to read what I was typing on my phone, his legal training apparently helping him recognize the potential consequences of whatever documentation I was creating. Brad arrived moments later, his face flushed from running across the parking lot in his expensive suit. The two men exchanged urgent whispers before Klein approached my window again, this time with a forced smile that couldn't hide the desperation in his eyes. "Dolores, could we speak with you for just a moment?" Klein called through the glass, his voice carrying the false friendliness that lawyers use when they're trying to prevent lawsuits. "There might be some additional paperwork we need to complete regarding your departure from the company." I rolled down my window just enough to hear clearly while maintaining a safe distance from their obvious attempts to retrieve my phone or prevent me from leaving the premises. Both men looked like they were struggling to maintain professional composure while internally screaming about the disaster that was unfolding in front of them. "Actually, I think we've completed all the necessary paperwork," I replied calmly, holding my phone where they could see the screen but not read the specific content. Unless you're planning to offer me a better severance package than the $0 I'm currently receiving for my 3 years of exemplary service. Brad stepped forward with the kind of desperate charm that politicians use during campaign scandals. Dolores, I think there might have been some miscommunication about your termination. Jessica mentioned that you seemed genuinely surprised by our concerns about the kitchen situation and were wondering if we moved too quickly toward disciplinary action. The sudden reversal was both predictable and pathetic. 30 minutes earlier, Brad had been lecturing me about respecting company property and understanding boundaries. Now he was suggesting that my termination might have been a regrettable misunderstanding that could potentially be reversed through good faith negotiations. Are you offering me my job back? I asked, genuinely curious about how far they were willing to go to contain the situation they had created. Klein and Brad exchanged glances that contained entire conversations about legal liability and damage control strategies. Klein nodded slightly, apparently giving Brad permission to make whatever concessions might be necessary to prevent me from pursuing external remedies for their misconduct. We're prepared to offer you immediate reinstatement with a promotion to senior marketing coordinator and a 15% salary increase, Brad announced, as if he was offering me a gift rather than trying to buy my silence about criminal activity. We'd also like to provide a formal letter of apology for any confusion about company policies regarding kitchen supplies. When I declined their reinstatement offer, Klein immediately produced a folder containing what appeared to be a pre-drafted non-disclosure agreement and severance package. The documents offered me 6 months of salary in exchange for agreeing never to discuss my employment experience at Pinnacle Digital Solutions with anyone, including potential future employers, government agencies, or legal representatives. This is our standard separation agreement, Klein explained, his voice taking on the mechanical tone that lawyers use when they're reciting rehearsed explanations. It provides generous compensation in exchange for mutual confidentiality about your employment relationship with the company. I pretended to review the documents while actually taking photographs of the legal language with my phone. The non-disclosure clauses were extraordinarily broad, prohibiting me from discussing not just the circumstances of my termination, but also any information I had learned about company operations during my employment. They were essentially offering to pay me to forget everything I had discovered about their criminal activities. But it was too late for damage control measures, because I had already contacted Morrison Industries directly about the overcharging scheme that affected their account. Morrison's legal team had received detailed documentation of fraudulent billing practices, complete with copies of the altered invoices and evidence of systematic price manipulation that had cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 2 years. I appreciate the offer, I told Klein, handing back his unsigned documents. But I've already committed to serving as a witness in several legal proceedings involving company practices that I observed during my employment here. The color drained from both men's faces as they realized that their containment strategy had failed before it even began. Morrison Industries wasn't just another client that could be mollified with discounted future services. They were a Fortune 500 company with legal resources that could pursue criminal prosecution as well as civil remedies for the fraud they had discovered. Sarah's involvement in the scheme was becoming increasingly problematic, as federal investigators began examining the financial records that I had provided to multiple agencies. Facing potential prison time for conspiracy to commit fraud, she made the predictable decision to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Her detailed confession revealed not just Brad's criminal activities but also Jessica's participation in covering up safety violations, employment law violations, and financial irregularities that had been ongoing for several years. The conspiracy was much larger than I had initially suspected, involving systematic corruption that affected multiple aspects of the company's operations. Local news stations picked up the story after Morrison Industries filed a lawsuit that became part of the public record. Business journalists began investigating Pinnacle Digital Solutions, uncovering additional instances of fraud involving other clients who had been similarly overcharged for services that were never properly delivered. I reached out to all affected clients directly, offering to serve as a witness in their legal proceedings against the company. What started as a wrongful termination complaint was rapidly escalating into a multi-million-dollar criminal investigation involving federal agencies, state regulators, and civil litigation from multiple parties who had been harmed by Brad's systematic fraud. The company's reputation was collapsing faster than Brad could implement damage control measures. Key employees began resigning rather than risk association with the criminal investigation. Clients started canceling contracts and demanding refunds, and vendors stopped providing services to a company that might not survive the legal and financial consequences of its misconduct. The federal investigation moved with the methodical efficiency of a machine designed specifically for dismantling corporate criminal enterprises. IRS agents arrived at Pinnacle Digital Solutions on a Tuesday morning with search warrants that covered everything from financial records to computer hard drives, transforming the office into a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape and federal badges. FBI financial crime specialists seized servers, copied email accounts, and interviewed every employee who might have knowledge of the fraudulent vendor relationships that had been systematically draining money from company accounts. The scope of the investigation expanded daily as agents discovered new evidence of mail fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, and violations of federal employment laws. Sarah's cooperation with prosecutors proved devastating to Brad's attempts to maintain his innocence. Her detailed testimony revealed not just the financial fraud but also a pattern of sexual harassment, workplace discrimination, and systematic violation of labor laws that had been ongoing for years. She provided recorded conversations, email correspondence, and documentary evidence that painted a picture of corporate corruption that shocked even experienced federal investigators. The investigation revealed that Brad had been operating this scheme across 3 other companies he owned, making Pinnacle Digital Solutions just one component of a much larger criminal enterprise. The total amount of fraud exceeded $10 million when all the shell companies and fake vendor relationships were properly documented and analyzed. Several high-profile business partners immediately distanced themselves from Brad and his companies, canceling contracts and issuing public statements about their commitment to ethical business practices. The local Chamber of Commerce revoked his membership, and 2 nonprofit organizations where he had served on boards of directors requested his immediate resignation. Current and former employees filed a class action lawsuit for wrongful termination, workplace harassment, unpaid overtime, and violations of federal employment laws. I became the lead plaintiff and primary witness, working with employment attorneys who specialized in corporate whistleblower cases and workplace rights violations. Jessica faced both criminal charges and the loss of her professional certifications as investigators uncovered evidence that she had been falsifying employment records, covering up safety violations, and participating in systematic discrimination against female employees. Her HR license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, effectively ending her career in human resources management. Media attention intensified as business journalists and investigative reporters began examining the broader implications of the case. I was interviewed by several publications about corporate whistleblowing and the importance of documenting workplace misconduct, becoming an unintentional advocate for employee rights and ethical business practices. The attention was overwhelming but necessary, as other employees from different companies began contacting me with similar stories of fraud, harassment, and retaliation they had experienced in their own workplaces. What started as my personal fight for justice was becoming part of a larger conversation about corporate accountability and worker protection. Morrison Industries not only received full restitution for the fraudulent overcharges, but also offered me a position as their director of ethical compliance at twice my previous salary. They wanted someone with practical experience in identifying and documenting corporate misconduct, and my role would involve developing procedures to prevent vendor fraud and ensure ethical business practices across all their operations. The irony wasn't lost on me that getting fired over a milk tea had led to a career opportunity that was far better than anything I could have achieved at Pinnacle Digital Solutions. But more importantly, the investigation had exposed systematic corruption that had harmed numerous employees, clients, and taxpayers who deserved better from companies operating in their communities. Tommy used his graphic design skills and industry connections to start his own creative agency, hiring several former Pinnacle employees who had been affected by Brad's misconduct. Together, we were creating businesses based on transparency, fair wages, and ethical practices that stood in stark contrast to the corruption we had witnessed. The legal proceedings moved forward with the inevitability of a freight train, gathering momentum as more evidence was uncovered and more witnesses came forward with testimony about Brad's criminal activities. What had started as a petty workplace conflict over kitchen supplies had evolved into a comprehensive federal investigation that would reshape how business fraud cases were prosecuted in our region. The courtroom was packed with journalists, former employees, and legal representatives when Brad Hutchinson received his sentence for conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, and multiple violations of federal employment laws. 8 years in federal prison and $15 million in restitution and fines represented justice not just for me, but for everyone who had been harmed by his systematic criminal enterprise. Sarah received 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service in exchange for her cooperation with prosecutors, while Jessica lost her HR license permanently and faced civil lawsuits from multiple employees whose rights she had violated during her tenure at Pinnacle Digital Solutions. The IRS whistleblower reward exceeded my wildest expectations: $412,000 for providing information that led to successful prosecution of tax fraud. Combined with the settlement from my wrongful termination lawsuit, I suddenly had financial resources that would have taken decades to accumulate through traditional employment. Morrison Industries proved to be everything that Pinnacle Digital Solutions should have been: a company that valued ethical practices, employee development, and transparent business operations. As their director of ethical compliance, I helped implement vendor verification procedures that prevented fraud while maintaining efficiency in their procurement processes. My role involved creating training programs for employees about identifying and reporting misconduct, developing policies that protected whistleblowers from retaliation, and working with legal teams to ensure compliance with federal regulations governing workplace safety and employee rights. Tommy's design company flourished as former Pinnacle employees brought their talents and client relationships to an organization that treated them with respect and compensated them fairly for their contributions. We had created a business model based on principles that seemed revolutionary only because they stood in such stark contrast to the corruption we had previously experienced. But the most rewarding aspect of this experience was the consulting firm I launched to help other whistleblowers navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of exposing workplace misconduct. Working with employment attorneys and advocacy organizations, I provided guidance to people who found themselves in similar situations to what I had experienced. 6 months after Brad's sentencing, I testified before a congressional subcommittee about corporate fraud and employee protection laws. My case had become a landmark example used in business ethics courses at universities across the country, demonstrating how individual employees could make a meaningful difference when they documented wrongdoing and followed proper legal channels. The consulting work connected me with people whose stories were remarkably similar to mine: dedicated employees who discovered criminal activity at their workplaces and faced retaliation when they tried to address the problems through internal channels. Some were accountants who found evidence of tax fraud, others were engineers who discovered safety violations, and many were administrative employees who witnessed discrimination and harassment that violated federal employment laws. Each case was unique, but the pattern was consistent. Companies that engaged in systematic misconduct often relied on employee silence and fear of retaliation to continue their illegal activities. When brave individuals decided to document and report these crimes, the results could be transformational not just for the whistleblowers, but for entire industries that needed ethical reform. My work expanded beyond individual consulting to include corporate training programs that helped companies develop ethical cultures and compliance procedures that prevented misconduct before it occurred. The goal was to create workplaces where employees felt safe reporting concerns and where management responded appropriately to potential problems. A year after the investigation began, Forbes magazine featured me in an article about leading advocates for workplace ethics, highlighting how my case had influenced federal policy discussions about corporate fraud and employee protection. The recognition was gratifying, but more important was the systemic change that was beginning to emerge from increased awareness about these issues. The milk tea that had cost me one job ultimately led to finding my true calling and making a meaningful impact on business practices nationwide. What started as personal injustice became a catalyst for exposing corruption that harmed many people and implementing reforms that would protect future employees from similar misconduct. Looking back on this experience, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about documenting evidence or following proper legal procedures, though those skills proved crucial to achieving justice. The real lesson was about having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it seems risky or difficult. Too many people suffer in silence when they witness workplace misconduct, either because they fear retaliation or because they doubt their ability to make a meaningful difference. But individual employees have more power than they realize when they're willing to document wrongdoing and seek help from appropriate agencies and organizations. My consulting firm has now helped expose fraud at 12 other companies, resulting in millions of dollars in recovered funds and improved working conditions for thousands of employees. Each case reinforces my belief that ethical business practices aren't just morally important, they're also economically beneficial for companies that want to build sustainable success. The transformation in my own life has been remarkable. From a marketing coordinator earning $45,000 per year, I now run a successful consulting firm, serve on the boards of 2 advocacy organizations, and regularly speak at conferences about corporate ethics and employee rights. But the greatest satisfaction comes from letters and emails from people whose lives have been improved because they found the courage to speak up about misconduct at their workplaces. These stories remind me that justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoers. It's about creating systems that protect good people and reward ethical behavior. The journey from that first sip of milk tea to federal testimony and business success hasn't always been easy, but it's been deeply meaningful in ways that I never could have anticipated when I was just trying to stay caffeinated during late-night work sessions. Have you ever witnessed workplace misconduct that you weren't sure how to address? The most important thing to remember is that you have options and resources available, even when the situation seems impossible to resolve. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this story if it resonated with your own experiences. Subscribe for more stories about standing up for what's right, and share this with anyone who might benefit from learning about employee rights and workplace ethics. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it inspires you to believe in your own power to make positive changes in your workplace and community.